For the next three sessions, we're going to be discussing the decade or so after the War of 1812, referred to commonly as the era of good feelings. We'll also talk about the Industrial Revolution, a period of economic growth and development that takes place during the same time period. And we'll finish it off with a look at one of the first big sectional crises between North and South that will result in the Missouri Compromise. For today, though, I'm going to focus on the presidency of James Monroe, who happens to be president during much of this time period. The era of good feelings. Basically, we're talking about this time period immediately following the War of 1812, extending on up into the early 1820s. So for about a decade or so worth of time, where we see within the United States, it's a period of relative peace and prosperity and stability. A lot of growth takes place during this time period. One thing that contributes to the political stability is the absence of bipartisan politics. With the demise of the Federalist Party at the end of the War of 1812, the Republican Party is free to move forward with its agenda with very little debate or resistance. Now, eventually, over the course of this time period, the Republican Party will begin to fracture, and we will see two parties emerge again, and we'll kind of get back to the usual routine of bipartisan political debate. But for several years, this absence of bipartisan politics really creates an atmosphere of stability, political stability. And as is common throughout history, political stability is very conducive to economic growth. And that's what we're going to see as a result taking place during this time period as well. Without a lot of the contentious debate that takes place typically in government, we see an environment where business and industry can grow rather freely, and America will begin to prosper during this time period. We'll talk more specifically about the Industrial Revolution in our next session, but this is one of the big things that takes place during this time period, this era of good feelings. We'll also see a characteristic of this era is strong feelings of patriotism and nationalism. And this is due in part to what happens during the War of 1812. Many people in America saw the war as in fact, a lot of people referred to it as the second war for independence. No big surprise here. We fought England during the Revolution, and in the War of 1812, we're fighting England again. So many people drew this comparison between the two wars. The War of 1812 was seen as our second war for independence. Now, while the War of 1812 wasn't a clear American victory, many people saw it as such, largely to the credit of people like Andrew Jackson, who won highly publicized victories and then in famous battles. And this helps contribute to this atmosphere of patriotic fervor and this idea of nationalism. America during this time period is developing its own sense of national identity. When we first got started with the nation, we were struggling to define ourselves. Who are we? We know we're not British because we just won our independence from England, but who are we really? What does it mean to be an American? This sense of nationalism and patriotic pride, this is really starting to take shape during this era of good feelings. And like I say, a lot of it has to do with this feelings that were developed during the War of 1812 in terms of our standing up for ourselves once again, fighting an old enemy, England, and surviving this dramatic process. Twice in the space of a generation, America has survived a war with England. So this is not any small or inconsequential thing. A lot of people look at this as a big deal, and it is. It contributes a great deal to this sense of patriotism and nationalism that's developing during this era. Finally, we see during this time period, partially as a result of all these other things, We see American culture really beginning to come into its own during this time period. Prior to the early 1800s, the 1820s, around that time frame, most American art and music and literature tended to mimic European styles. The few artists, the few American artists who were creating original works, they really tended to copy and mimic the styles that were dominant in European art and music. Starting around the 1820s or so, during this era of good feelings, we'll see authors like James Fenimore Cooper and artists like Thomas Cole and composers like Stephen Foster start producing art and music and literature that are distinctively American. The art and literature explores American themes. They're produced by American artists and composers and writers. So these three men are, of course, all of these men are working in around the same time frame during the 1820s, and of course a little bit later on to 1830s, 1840s. Some of their works span, of course, their whole careers. But these men like these are just getting started in their fields during this time period, and they become characteristic of this era. So we see American culture really beginning to define itself during this time period. Most of this era of good feelings, James Monroe will be the president of the United States, and he kind of has an easy job of it because things are so stable, because there's so much political stability, and of course by extension economic stability and growth and development. Monroe's got a pretty easy job of being president during this time period. Not a whole lot of really big challenges, very few crises to deal with. So a lot of good things happening. He's got a pretty easy job during this time period. Monroe will be elected in 1816. Again, as he won pretty easily, a sweeping victory with the Republicans still in control of Congress. Monroe, of course, a Republican, is going to win very easily. And we see the Federalist Party, of course, is non-existent at the national level, so there's really not a whole lot of competition here. So Monroe will win a very easy election, and of course his presidency will be characterized by many successes and a period of prosperity. Some of the things that that are going to characterize Monroe's presidency. We'll take a look at some foreign policy or diplomatic issues that come up during his presidency. A lot of these diplomatic events or issues are going to be focused on improving relations with our neighbors, specifically with British Canada and Spanish Mexico. So Spain and England are our neighbors here in the Western Hemisphere, and a lot of these foreign policy decisions or events are going to be aimed at trying to improve relationships with these neighbors, specifically along our borders, more clearly defining our borders with Canada and Mexico, and an attempt to try and normalize or stabilize relations. And it's no real surprise or coincidence that these important treaties with England and Canada, or England and Mexico, take place during this time period, because both England and Spain are pretty much worn out from the many years of war that they've just endured in Europe, and they're in a very conciliatory mood. The last thing they want is more trouble. So when it comes time to address these border issues, with our U.S. border with Canada and the U.S. border with Mexico, which of course is still owned by Spain. When it comes time to address these issues, both Spain and England are very ready and willing to sit down and negotiate with us and find a solution that's mutually beneficial. So beginning with the Convention of 1818, basically what this is going to do is it's going to clarify and define the border between the United States and Canada. and we're talking specifically between the Great Lakes and the Rocky Mountains. Now, prior to the year prior to this convention of 1818, the United States signed an agreement with England. It's called the Rush-Bagot Agreement. This is in 1817. This effectively demilitarized the U.S.-Canadian border. And take a look at a map here. Basically, it removed all ships and troops from the Great Lakes area and this border between the United States and Canada. So the Rush-Bagot Agreement in 1817 created the longest demilitarized or unprotected border in the world, and actually it still holds that title today. But the Convention of 1818 is kind of just a follow-on or a follow-up agreement to help define this border between the U.S. and Canada. What it's going to do is it's going to identify the 49th parallel as the official border between British Canada and the United States, extending from essentially the Great Lakes out to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. So now we have from Maine all the way out to the Rocky Mountains, we've got a clearly defined and an unprotected border with England, with British Canada. And this it says a lot about our relationship with England at the time. We just fought a war with them, but in the big picture, there are no real bitter feelings. Yeah, there's some people will still harbor grudges, on both sides for many years. But as a whole, in the big picture, the United States and England are friends at this point. And this Rush-Bagot Agreement in 1817 and the Convention of 1818, these two treaties exemplify this friendly relationship between the United States and Britain. So much so that we feel no need, neither side feels any need to place troops along this border. Also, part of this Convention of 1818 is that the United States and England agreed to jointly occupy this Oregon Territory. And we're talking about Oregon Territory. It's not just the present-day state of Oregon, but it includes Oregon, Washington, Idaho, most of British Columbia. It's a large territory that straddles this 49th parallel. No one was really living out here, not really any settlements, but it had just been lightly explored by both countries. We agreed to occupy it jointly for a period of 10 years as part of this Convention of 1818. So we're improving relationships with an old enemy who is now our best friend, and will be pretty much for the rest of history. Even today, England is pretty much the United States' best friend and one of our largest trading partners. Similar treaty is going to take place the following year with Spain. The Transcontinental Treaty, or sometimes referred to as the Adams-Onis Treaty, because John Quincy Adams, who was our Secretary of State during this time, during the Monroe administration, and Luis de Onis, who is the Spanish ambassador to America during this time. These men will draft this treaty, this Transcontinental Treaty, and this treaty will be aimed specifically at defining the border between the United States and Spanish Mexico. Looking again at this same map, we see here that we're talking about this border of the Louisiana Territory. When we purchased this Louisiana Territory from France in the early 1800s, the borders of this territory were not specifically defined, and now it wasn't really a problem for quite a few years because there was no one living out here. No American settlers out here. There were no Spanish settlers out here, so the ill-defined border wasn't really a problem. But now that Spain is looking to hold on. Basically, Mexico is one of the last possessions that Spain has in the Western Hemisphere. Most of their empire has won its independence. So Spain is looking to more clearly define its remaining territory. So what Spain does is that in 1819 they offer to sell us the Florida territory for $5 million in exchange for agreeing to a more clearly defined border between the United States and Spanish Mexico. And this border will loosely follow several rivers, the Sabine, the Arkansas, and the Red River, and all these rivers here will eventually make up what will be the border of the state of Texas. And you can kind of see that starting to become clear here, where these rivers form the border between the Louisiana Territory and Spanish Mexico. You can start to see the outline of Texas starting to take shape. And then, of course, from the Rocky Mountains, it follows the 42nd parallel all the way out to the Pacific coast. So now we have a clearly defined border with both of our neighbors. And this goes a long way toward improving relationships with both countries, both England and Spain. When you have clearly defined borders, everyone knows where their territory is, and there's no confusion or disagreements. And of course, we end up picking up the rest of Florida as part of this deal. So the United States territory is now more clearly defined, and we know where we can expand into and where we need to respect other people's territory. So both of these treaties, again, they go a long way toward normalizing relationships between the United States and its neighbors. Our final piece of foreign policy here, or diplomacy, that defines the Monroe presidency is this Monroe Doctrine of 1823. And this is the culmination of a couple of different issues that have been simmering for a little while, and somewhat related to our border treaties that we just signed. Between 1817 and 1822, most of Central and South America will win its independence from Spain. So Spain's empire is kind of on the decline. Basically, Mexico and what is today Cuba and Puerto Rico are the last few things that Spain has control of during this time period. There's a conference in 1822 in Europe, basically a meeting of several different European nations who get together and discuss the possibility of helping Spain to regain its former empire in the Western Hemisphere. Now, nothing official ever comes out of this discussion, but it's the fact that it's being discussed makes America somewhat nervous. For these years where all these parts of the former Spanish Empire are becoming independent, it works out really well for us because the United States begins trading with a lot of these newly independent nations. It helps us grow our economy, and of course it helps these new nations get on their feet economically with international trade. If Spain were to reassert itself in this region, it would interfere with the trade relationships that we've been working to build in the recent years. On top of that, also around the same time in 1821, Russia is beginning to assert itself in the Pacific Northwest, claiming territories all down the Pacific coast, from Alaska all the way down into the Oregon Territory. So while Russia, we never see Russia as a real threat at this point, Russia's assertion in the Pacific Northwest and the rumors about Spain attempting to reassert itself in Central and South America prompt the United States to take a more of a stand here diplomatically, and that's the inspiration for this Monroe Doctrine. President Monroe and his Secretary of State John Quincy Adams draft an idea, and it's not a law. This is something that is introduced by the president in his annual address to Congress, essentially his State of the Union address. So it's not a law, but it's when the president addresses Congress and he introduces this Monroe Doctrine, as they start calling it. It's part of how America will define its foreign policy, its diplomatic affairs. Basically, this is an outline for American diplomatic affairs for the near future, so defined by the president and his Secretary of State. And keep in mind, of course, diplomatic affairs are the responsibility of the executive branch, the president. So this is well within his area of responsibility. So when Monroe speaks to Congress in December of 1823, it's partially in response to a lot of these events that have been simmering in the background regarding European involvement in the Western Hemisphere. Basically, in a nutshell, Monroe declares that the Western Hemisphere is off limits to any further European colonization. Basically, he says that From now on, the Americas, North and South America, are closed to European colonization. Now, any attempt by any European nation to assert themselves in this region or to establish new colonies will be seen as a threat, a direct threat to the United States and its safety, its interest. So this is a pretty bold statement. Basically, President Monroe is telling Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. Now, he clarifies, he's very clear that he's not talking about existing colonies. He's not talking about things like British Canada or Spanish Mexico. He's not talking about these. Spain already controls Mexico. England already controls Canada. So they're already there. That's fine. No problem. Monroe is referring specifically to any new colonies, any new attempts by European nations to establish colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And again, he's specifically addressing these rumors about European nations, discussing reestablishing the old Spanish Empire. So when Monroe makes this statement, it's really kind of bold and somewhat brazen in that the United States is in no position to back this up. Basically, he's rolling the dice here. He's really hoping that no European nation will challenge this doctrine, because if anybody decided to challenge this doctrine, there's not a whole lot we could do to stop them. By saying that any attempt by a European nation to involve itself or assert itself in the Western Hemisphere will be seen as a threat to the United States, there's not a lot we can do about this. So Monroe he's being bold, he's being brazen here, but and he's kind of rolling the dice, but it pays off because as luck would have it, England, who is our new BFF, England is going to support this Monroe Doctrine completely. England, as it turns out, has also has a lucrative trade relationship with these newly independent Latin American countries. And plus, England shares the Oregon Territory with us, so England has a vested interest in keeping the Western Hemisphere open and free for trade. If Spain reasserted itself in its old empire, that would also threaten England's commercial interests there as well. So England backs us up on this Monroe Doctrine, and they do so vocally. England seconds the motion. They advertise that they support this and they endorse this doctrine. They think it's a good idea. And with the backing of England, this Monroe Doctrine now it carries a little bit more weight. So if it was just us saying this, it might not really carry that much weight at this point in time. In the 1820s, America was not really considered to be a serious threat to the world. So it's unlikely people would have taken us seriously. But with England's backing, now it carries a little bit more weight, and the Monroe Doctrine will never be challenged. No one's going to challenge the Monroe Doctrine, and this will become basically the foundation of American foreign policy for the next 150 years or so. Even into the mid-20th century, when the United States foreign policy centers around the idea of containment, specifically referring to communism. Even containment is kind of an extension of the ideas outlined in this Monroe Doctrine, which comes to serve as a rationalization for American foreign policy for the next 150, even today. Really, this Monroe Doctrine carries a lot of influence. Most of America's foreign policy tends to center around America protecting its interests around the globe, and the Monroe Doctrine is the first real articulation of that idea, where America will see threats to its interests around the world as a threat to America itself. So Monroe Doctrine, kind of a big deal. It will carry a long impact in American foreign policy for many, many years to come. During this time period of political stability, the Republican Party, free now to move forward with this agenda without any significant resistance from an opposing party, they start to adopt bits and pieces of the old Federalist agenda. So we call it the New Republican Agenda, referring to this time period. But while it is new for the Republicans, the ideas themselves are not new, and most of these things that will define the Republican agenda during this time period are, like I said, bits and pieces of the former Federalist agenda. Things like government support of economic developments, protectionist economic policies, trade and commerce, banking. A lot of these things were part of the old Federalist agenda. The Republicans now will adopt many of these things or variations of these things as part of their new agenda. And we tend to refer to this as the American system. And basically, I think it's Henry Clay who dubbed this agenda the American system. Basically, a policy of economic growth and development that is somewhat nationalistic, or economic nationalism, as they call it. And this is kind of I guess, an early version of an America First type policy, where the policies, specifically with regard to trade and economic development, tend to focus on America over its trading partners. So this economic nationalism, as they call it, or this the American system. And a lot of this is going to be put forth by this new up-and-coming younger generation of congressmen that we see assuming leadership roles during this time period. People like Henry Clay from Kentucky, John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, and Daniel Webster from Massachusetts. These men are up-and-comers. They're young, they're ambitious, they're focused on growth and expansion of the nation, very nationalistic, very enthusiastic about making America into a more prominent nation in the world community. All of them espouse these ideas of the nation above all else. This pretty much the definition of nationalism. John C. Calhoun is the one exception here. After a while, Calhoun is going to kind of do an about face and move in the other direction politically. Basically, Calhoun will eventually become one of the strongest supporters of states' rights over the federal government. And Calhoun will become a staunch sectionalist as well. And no big surprise, Calhoun from South Carolina, he's going to stay true to his roots, especially once the nation begins to divide itself north against south over various issues, such as states' rights. Calhoun will follow his home state of South Carolina. South Carolina becomes one of the big voices, the strongest voices in that states' rights debate, and Calhoun will be their mouthpiece. But the old guard, the George Washingtons and the Thomas Jeffersons and the John Adamses, these guys are beginning to retire from political life. And a new generation of congressmen are beginning to assume dominant roles in Congress. These guys that we're talking about, and we'll revisit these names numerous times in the coming weeks as we talk about various issues that will define the nation's politics during this time period. But here is where they are first coming on the scene. So some of the things that this new Republican agenda tend to espouse are things like business and commerce, industry. We're going to talk more about industrial development. We'll do a whole day on just industrial revolution. But things like banking are going to become important as well. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. In a situation where you're trying to promote economic growth, a stable financial system or banking system is going to be an essential part of economic growth and economic stability. Without stable finances, economic growth is really not possible, or it is uncontrollable. It grows and it expands and contracts uncontrollably. A stable banking system really is important in keeping that growth steady and stable. So what's going to happen is that this new Republican agenda will now include the Bank of the United States. Now, what's ironic about this is that the Republicans, when the original Bank of the U.S. was chartered in 1791, the Republicans were the most outspoken critics of this bank. They said it was unconstitutional, it was unnecessary, we don't need it, we don't want it, we shouldn't have it. But Congress was able to pass it, and the bank came into existence in 1791. What ends up happening, though, is that over the course of the years, Congress allowed the bank's charter to expire. So by the time we get to the War of 1812, there is no U.S. bank. It expired, and in order to finance the war, Congress had to rely on state and local banks for funds to finance the war, which proved to be almost disastrous because these state and local banks were not nearly as stable or secure or solvent as the U.S. bank, and there was a lot of economic chaos and instability that resulted. But so basically what happens is that in the absence of a national bank, all these state and local banks just pop up everywhere. And the problem is that none of these banks are regulated. There's no such thing as banking regulations during this time period. If you open up a bank, you can do whatever you want to with it in terms of lending policies and borrowing and how you manage the money of your depositors. That is totally up to you. There are no rules regarding banking. And what ends up happening is that these state and local banks, being so unregulated, many of them will have irresponsible and reckless lending practices, all kinds of wild, unpredictable interest rates, and so forth. And they'll loan money that they don't even have in an attempt to make easy profits. And this oftentimes leads to disaster because when in an economic recession, you people want their money out of the bank doesn't have any money because they've loaned it all out. They've loaned out more money than they actually have, and it causes these banks to collapse, and this creates panic and confusion. A national bank will help stabilize this situation. So in 1816, Congress is going to recharter the Bank of the United States. We'll call it and they're going to call it the Second Bank of the United States. So it's the same exact thing as before. They use the same exact model that Hamilton had originally outlined for the Bank of the U.S. They just simply recharter it in 1816. When the bank opens, Congress capitalizes this bank with $35 million. So it becomes the largest, most stable, and powerful bank in the country at the time. And due to its size, and of course the size of its holdings, its accounts, the Bank of the U.S. has a lot of power and influence over the economy. If you're a smaller bank and you want to borrow money for investment, you go to the Bank of the United States. If you're going to do business with the United States government, like a government contract or something, that business will be transacted through the Bank of the United States. Since the Bank of the United States has very strict lending policies, it influences other banks to kind of comply. If you want to do business in the banking industry in America, you kind of do business the way the U.S. bank wants you to, and this helps to stabilize the economy. It stabilizes the flow of money through the economy. It's an important part of economics. Again, at the risk of turning this into an economics class, a stable banking system is an essential element for economic growth. People don't invest money in new projects if they don't know where the economy is going. If they don't know what's going to happen to their money when they invest it, they don't invest it. So a stable banking system is an important element here. So again, the irony here is that the Republicans are advocating for this Bank of the United States, whereas before they condemned it as unconstitutional. Basically, they're realizing now that a bank is an essential element in a stable economy. Another thing that the Republicans are going to include in their economic agenda here is the idea of protective tariffs. A tariff is essentially a tax on imports. So any goods imported into a country, if there's a tariff on those goods, those goods are being taxed. So this often is referred to as protectionist economics or economic nationalism because a tariff is intended to protect domestic businesses, domestic industries. And the reason Congress decides to adopt a tariff in 1816 and it amounts to about a 20 to 25% tax on manufactured goods that can be produced in America. They don't tax everything. They don't tax every import. They're only taxing those imports that compete directly with American industries. So if America is not importing, if America doesn't produce a particular type of thing and somebody imports it, then that's fine. There's no tax on it. But if there's an American company that produces this thing and there's an import of similar type, then that import will be taxed. So it's only a tax on those goods that are competing directly with American businesses. And this is designed to protect those businesses from competition. We can look at, as an example, we can take, for instance, we're just going to use shovels. So let's say that there's an American factory, a small factory that's producing shovels. And there's also a British manufacturer that manufactures shovels and imports them to the United States. So when the farmer goes down to the general store to purchase a new shovel, he sees two shovels, an American one and a British one. Since the American industries are small and just getting started, they cannot produce in large quantities. So they only produce a few shovels each year. So in order to stay in business and make their money, they must charge a higher price for those shovels, say $10. Well, the British manufacturer, they're large, established firm. They've been producing shovels for many years. They can afford to scale their production toward mass production, and just basic economics. The more of something that you produce, the cheaper it is per unit. So the British company can sell their shovels for $5 a shovel because they produce so many of them. They can afford to sell at a lower price. Now, when that farmer goes into the general store and he sees those two shovels, the $10 American shovel, the $5 British shovel, he's not thinking about economic policy. He's not thinking about the national economy and the growth of American industry. He's thinking, I need a new shovel because the one I have is broken and I got to buy one. I have a limited amount of money in my pocket, so I'm looking for a bargain here. I'll take this $5 shovel. He's not thinking about where that shovel came from. He's just thinking, okay, here's a bargain. I'm going to save money. I'm going to buy this cheaper shovel because I need one. Now, what happens if everybody does this? They keep buying the cheaper shovel. No, the American company's not selling any shovels. So what ends up happening is this American company, if it can't sell its product, it's going to go out of business. So here's where the tariff becomes important. Congress passes this tariff in 1816 in order to protect American companies that are unable to compete with larger British companies. So what happens is this tariff will place a tax on that British shovel. And again, I'm just using the same example here. They'll place a tax on that British shovel, making it now $12 as compared to the American shovel, which is only $10. So now the American shovel is no cheaper than it was the day before. But when that farmer goes in to buy that shovel, he sees two shovels, a $10 one and a $12 one. He's looking for the bargain. He wants to spend as little money as possible, so he's going to buy the $10 shovel because the $12 shovel is just out of his price range now. So now people are buying the American shovel instead of the British shovel, and this provides income and profits to the American company, which allows them to grow and expand, and eventually they will be able to compete on their own. So essentially a tariff is kind of like a crutch to help support or shore up a fledgling industry until they can become big enough and strong enough to compete on their own. It's kind of like a little league baseball. You know, a kid, when little kids start playing baseball, they have the ball sitting on a tee. They call it T-ball, right? Well, eventually after the kid develops his skill enough, he doesn't need the tee anymore. He can hit a regular pitch thrown by a pitcher. So this tariff is intended to be a temporary support in order to help these businesses grow, and eventually these American companies will be able to compete on their own without the tariff, and the tariff becomes no longer necessary. But what ends up happening, though, is that supporters of tariffs tend to want to keep the tariff going longer than is necessary. And if that happens, if the American company grows and becomes prosperous and competitive on its own, and the tariff is no longer necessary, the tariff then becomes kind of an obstacle to trade. What will eventually happen is that the British company will put tariffs on American products that are exported to England, and say, okay, you tax our stuff, we're going to tax your stuff. And this has the effect of restricting trade or stifling international trade, and that hurts everyone's economy. So a tariff is a good thing in the beginning because it helps domestic industries get on their feet, but after a certain period of time, a tariff becomes an obstacle to trade. And actually, of course, tariff will the bottom line is that tariff increases the cost of living for the people at the bottom. That farmer looking for a new shovel, he now has to pay $10 for a shovel, whereas before he only had to pay $5. So the bottom line from the farmer's perspective is that his cost of living has increased as a result of this tariff. Again, he's not thinking about helping American industry to grow and prosper. He's thinking about his own cost of living. And for that reason, the tariff will become a controversial issue. Many of the southern states where there are no industries will see the tariff as having a damaging effect on their economy. So most of the opponents of the tariff will be southern states because they don't benefit from it. Most of the factories and businesses in America are in the northern states, and they will, of course, benefit from this tariff, but southern states won't benefit from it at all. In addition to that, the cost of living, again, like our shovel analogy, the cost of living will go up for a lot of people in the South because now they will have to pay for more expensive American products than cheaper imported products. So the tariff is going to become a very controversial issue. And really the same can be said for this Bank of the United States. Over the course of the next 15 or 20 years or so, the tariff and the bank are going to become lightning rods for sectional controversy, because the banking industry tends to benefit business and industry more so than agriculture. Northerners will support the bank, Southerners will criticize the bank. Same thing with the tariff. So the bank and the tariff together will be seen by many Southerners, and of course people on the western frontier as well, as having benefiting only the northern business interests. So for that reason, the bank and the tariff will both draw a lot of criticism and become the center of much debate in the following years. But here's where those stories begin. And really, if you're looking at a big picture in terms of economic development and growth for the nation, these two things will benefit the nation, but they are not without consequences. And some of those consequences will escalate into major sectional issues that'll come about, particularly once we get to the Andrew Jackson administration. Both of these issues will reach crisis proportions, and we'll talk about more along those lines in the weeks to come. That's all we have time for today. We'll come back next time. We'll begin our look at the Industrial Revolution and the improvement of American transportation infrastructure as a component of that Industrial Revolution. So until next time, take care.